Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold here, fresh off watching the candidates in Toronto, Canada. I got home about 2 hours and 15 minutes ago, so it's about time I did a lecture. This lecture is on the Vienna Game, and I want to read a note from the sponsor. The sponsor's name is Christian. He's an adult chess enthusiast from Vienna, Austria. And according to Wikipedia, the opening is named after Vienna, Austria, which makes sense. He writes, I enjoy your channel very much and wanted to support your work, so I decided to sponsor this lecture. I wish you all the best for your upcoming projects in the future. Go Ben and Karen. And then that's the lecture. Oh wait, no, that's the note from the sponsor. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, you can contact my wife Karen. Her email is karen@atlchessclub.com, and then you can sponsor a lecture. The Wikipedia article on the Vienna Game is very broad, and it makes some assertions which I think about half the grandmasters wouldn't agree with. So, but man, it was, whoever wrote the article was pretty confident about their understanding of the Vienna. So the Vienna Game is this position, which you can see, and white plays knight c3 on move 2, which is much, much, much less common than knight f3, especially at the top level. And in my opinion, which if you have a chess coach, they may not agree with my opinion, this is actually good for club players for white, because the people who have black aren't expecting the Vienna. And it's just as good as knight f3. Chess is a draw, so everything's equal, and white's trying to get an advantage by either playing better than your opponent, which is one way to do it. That's a tough way. The other way is to know the opening better than your opponent. And by playing less common openings that are just as good as the common openings, then you can get an advantage. They talk about the history of the Vienna Game. They say when it started out, it was a way for white to play a king's gambit without being so crazy, sort of a modified king's gambit where white's going to play f4 soon. Okay, they call knight f6 the Falkbeer variation, although I wouldn't call it that. Knight f6 is the most common move by quite a bit for black in this position. And f4 is the most common move, even though whoever wrote the Wikipedia article doesn't agree with that. They even talk about Levy-Roseman. So maybe Levy wrote the article. Bishop c4 is another move that you can play. And g3 is another move. And we're going to cover all of those in the class. We're not going to cover a3 because that's stupid. Okay, and then the max long defense, where black plays knight c6 on move 2, is very rare. And typically, white plays f4, and we're going to talk about that somewhat. And then we're going to talk about g3, which I think is actually covered earlier in the article. Yeah, after knight f6. So, okay. And one of the variations of the Vienna has a really cool name. So if you don't care how good your position is, but you want to say a cool name, then you should definitely try to play one side of the Frankenstein Dracula variation, which sounds like I made it up. I've known that name for over 40 years, but actually Wikipedia mentions it too. So that's cool. Okay, so normally I look at 3 or 4 games during a lecture, but I thought there were 5 distinct variations that could happen in the Vienna, that could happen at the grandmaster or club level. Now, obviously, you can play anything you want on move 2 or 3, but it's just not going to be considered very good. The first game we're going to look at was from a U.S. championship in 2007. And this, I actually played in the 2008 U.S. championship in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The 2007 U.S. championship, which I did not play, was in Stillwater, Oklahoma, because as you all know, Oklahoma is a hotbed of chess in America. I mean, probably the only 2 tournaments ever to take place in Oklahoma. Okay, and this is Hikaru Nakamura, who I just saw, and Alex Yermolinsky, and I've played Yermolinsky several times. And it's very difficult to find games in the Vienna where both players are strong grandmasters unless it's a blitz game. At the very highest levels in slow chess, it's not played very often, and it should be, because it gives white chances to get an advantage, just like knight f3 does. Okay, now actually, the line that they played, which I consider the most common in the Vienna, is knight f6, f4. And so it's like white's playing a king's gambit, but we've thrown in the moves knight c3 and knight f6. And I would say that that helps white, because sometimes in the king's gambit, black takes the gambit. And here, that's not considered very good. If you take on f4, then e5, I mean, I don't know where the knight's supposed to go. I think queen e7 is the main move, but the knight's gonna have to go back to g8. So that's, nobody takes on f4. And everybody plays the move d5. That's probably 95% of games. And so this position, we're gonna look at 2 different moves, because before 2010, and I made up that year, but I'm close, everybody here played the move knight f3. And then at some point in the 2010s, white was also playing queen f3, which is poo-pooed by Wikipedia. Queen f3 is no good. But I mean, queen f3 is like the main move now. So there's actually a very funny game, which I'm not going to show in the lecture, and now I'm going to show it to you. I wasn't planning on showing it, because black followed the Wikipedia recommendation, which also Yermolinsky followed. And it's a game, David Howell was white, and it was a blitz game against a weaker grandmaster. And I memorized the game because the game's almost over. Knight c6, which I think Yermolinsky played, takes, knight d4, queen c3. And Wikipedia, I don't know who wrote the article, says like this is good for black. But a grandmaster in a blitz game made the worst move ever here and lost next move to David Howell. He played bishop b4 with the idea of queen takes b4, knight takes c2 check, winning the queen. And David Howell played queen takes knight. So I guess guy with black isn't very good at blitz chess, but he did prove that he wasn't cheating. So that's good. Okay, and when I was at the World Open about 3 years ago, there were 2 kids playing. They were between 12 and 17, and they were very high rated, and they were blitzing the opening, and black very quickly played the move f5, which I think is actually quite common. So I'm sure f5 is also a good move for black. Okay, so Yermolinsky did play knight c6. Nakamura did not take on e4. I think if we follow the Howell game, I think black should just take the knight, and then his queen defends the knight. And this is probably okay for black. If it wasn't okay for black, I don't think Nakamura would avoid it and Yermolinsky would go into it. So the fact that Nakamura didn't play this way indicates to me this is fine for black. So Nakamura played bishop b5. And they actually played a main line of sorts. Black traded on c3 and played queen h4 check and queen e4 check, trading queens. And I think this is an excellent line for black. Unfortunately, for Yermolinsky, he's not as good as Nakamura. So, they get some position which is computer equal, but sort of complicated. And then the better player outplays the weaker player. So it's like every other opening. So Nakamura traded queens and played bishop f4. This is fine for black, but it's a weird pawn structure. Normally we don't see the pawns on the other side of each other, and also white can ruin black's pawn structure, if you wanted to, giving up the two bishops. So it's sort of a hard position to play because you're not sure which advantages are important and which disadvantages aren't. Like, is black going to lose this pawn? If white traded, would that be a terrible pawn structure for black? Or would black's two bishops be more important? I don't know. So that's why I think if you're playing a low-rated player, the Vienna is a very good opening because you get positions that are difficult to evaluate. If you're the better player, you should evaluate them better than your opponent, especially when there's so few games in the line that are slow chess. There's blitz games and there's some rapid games in the Vienna lately, but a lot of the Vienna theory started in the 1800s. And then, people in the 1900s stopped playing the Vienna. It's a much more common opening when it was, created. Okay, so h6, I assume he wants to play g5. Knight e2. Yeah, I was right, g5. You can't take the pawn on e5 because it's illegal. The knight's pinned. So he attacked the pawn with his bishop. Knight d4 attacks the knight on c6. That's very important. So bishop d7 is forced. And then e6, confusing the audience. I guess taking with the bishop doesn't make sense because then the knight's not defended sufficiently. So he took with the pawn. So black's a pawn up, but black's pawn structure looks a bit odd. Knight takes, then a6. I guess whichever way black recaptures, it's going to have a really bad pawn structure, like takes and then maybe bishop c4. And then, okay, black's pawn structure is terrible, even though black is up a pawn. So Yermolinsky played a6 to keep his pawn structure intact. Bishop c4, and then he took with the bishop, giving away his extra pawn. But now it's equal pawns, and you could argue black's better because white's majority doesn't seem very important because it's double pawns, and black has a passed pawn. On the other hand, white can castle either way, and black cannot castle. So does that matter? Probably it's equal, but it's a complicated equal where you assume the better player is going to win. Rook d8, castles, bishop d5, trading off the bishop so that black's king can get to a comfortable square. And Nakamura says, no, I want to keep my bishop. And so black was able to castle. a3, I guess if the rook moves and we take the pawn on a2 like Fischer, although that was h2, and then we play b3 trapping the bishop, this pawn is also weak. So he just played a3 and said, you can't take my pawns. And then the bishop on f5 is pretty strong. Not much is happening. Lots of trading. And it's funny, like this pawn's passed, but it basically has no hope. That pawn can never promote. And likely in the next, 10 moves, white's going to capture it. So a5, messing the pawns up again, or trying to. Black tries to get counterplay, and white says, you can have counterplay, I'm going to queen a pawn. And now black wants to also get some queens. So Nakamura played bishop g1. Now it looks like black's doing pretty well. e2 check and bishop g3 check and so forth. Nakamura literally doesn't care. He just takes on a6. And in this position, Yermolinsky, I think he lost on time, but he's actually losing here. So if you play bishop g3 with the almost unstoppable threat of e2, e1, I just take it. So that stopped it. And if you play e2 check and I play king e1, if you check with the bishop, I can just take this pawn. And if you check with the bishop here, I just block. And problem is, even though black has some tricks, like for example, check and check winning the bishop, I mean, I'm attacking the rook, and then this pawn on a7 is going to queen. You can't stop the pawn on a7 from queening. So actually, Nakamura has the e-pawn pretty well defended. And if you check and take the free piece, then again after a7, I'm going to queen my pawn. Although here, it looks like rook g2 check is a good move. So I wonder, I guess I was wrong and he would play king at g2 and then bishop f2. And then once again, white's making a queen. And what white is threatening here, well, if it's white's move, every rook move wins. But if somehow black attacks this pawn, like bishop e3, so if the rook moves away, we can take it, then white can play rook f8 check, and then queen with check. Or, actually, the other way I was going to win loses. I was going to go here and then fork, but I forgot you could play rook e7. Although when I said it loses, this is almost certainly a draw. But, okay, so I think Yermolinsky lost on time after taking on a6, but I think white's winning anyway. And that was an example which I would expect a lot of Viennas to have if it was played more at the top level, that the better player would win from a position which is maybe computer equal, but very complicated. And I think that gives excellent chances compared to some other openings, which we see too much of, where they're playing 25 moves of theory, and then they start to think, like Berlin's and stuff. Okay, so that was one variation. Next variation, this was played by Nigel Short against Debashis in Kolkata, 2014. Nigel likes to play unusual openings with white that are e4 related, like Bishop's opening and the Scotch Gambit and the Scotch and Ponziani and King's Gambit. So why not the Vienna? And Nigel Short, as most of you know, except for one thing, of all the grandmasters in the world, it's possible nobody has more chess books than Nigel. Nigel Short has thousands of chess books. He collects chess books. And one of the genres of books he likes are old books, books that were published 1800s and early 1900s. And so he has a lot of analysis from over 100 years ago on these unusual double king pawn openings that aren't really played much anymore. So he knows it better than his opponent. Now, Nigel played the old way. In this position, we just saw Nakamura play queen f3. Nigel played knight f3, which used to be the most common move. Bishop e7's a move. Black can play other moves. White can also play d3 here. That's another move. Queen e2, threatening to take on e4 and win a pawn. And Nigel takes with the D pawn, which is what we saw Nakamura do. And Nigel, since he blocked his bishop on f1, he's going to castle queenside. So he does do that. And like this position, I mean, I'm sure black is fine, but I don't think it's easy to play if you don't have a lot of reference of other games. If you're playing black in an Italian or a Ruy Lopez, you've probably seen hundreds of games with similar pawn structures and castling kings and where the minor pieces go. And like this kind of position, who's seen this kind of position? It's a weird position. So I think for somebody who's clearly the better player, which in this case is Nigel, 170 points higher than his opponent, this is a great opening to try to win with. Okay, h4, I guess Nigel thinks his opponent's going to castle kingside. Queen a5, threatening the pawn on a2. a3, just like Nakamura. Rook b8, black does not mask his intentions. He's going to play b5, b4. Nigel plays bishop g5, trying to trade off the dark squared bishop, which would be nice on this diagonal if the queen side opens. And he takes with the king. Not even sure I would consider taking with the king, but okay, I'm not playing the game. So, queen e3, attacking the pawn on c5, and also queen g5 check looks sort of annoying. b4, takes, a4, which makes sure the rook can't get in the game here. And the other idea is if we take the pawn, then Nigel can play queen c5 check, which I don't think black wants to happen. But he did take the pawn. And if black doesn't take the pawn, I guess white plays b3, and black's attack is sort of done on the queen side. It's all blocked up. So Nigel got his check in. And I don't know where to put the black king. It seems like everywhere's bad. Played d7, which looks crazy. But if you go to e8, you're blocking your rook from ever getting into the game. I think when he played king d7, his plan was to play like rook here and have his king go to e8. Knight to d4. Nigel isn't afraid of this check, because if you check, now your queen is attacked and your knight's attacked. And I think white just wins, because the bishop's controlling a6. So if you want to save your queen and save your knight, you would play queen a4, and then after b3, I guess you resign, because you can't move your queen and save your knight. So queen a1 looks good, but I think it just loses immediately. So he played rook hc8, which I was alluding to earlier. Bishop b5, that looks pretty good. Sacks the exchange, but I mean his knight's hanging, so sort of has to sack the exchange. Knight takes e5, and here Nigel finishes the game off cleanly by sacrificing the exchange, although not really sacking the exchange. So here black resigned. If he plays king to e8, then we play knight d6 check, and then we play knight takes rook discovered check, then this knight's hanging, and black's getting mated, and I guess the other legal move is to take, and then black doesn't have any pieces left. He had pieces, and now he doesn't. So king somewhere, I take this, and white's up a piece for nothing. So like every move should win in this position. Black's threatening mate in 1, but probably white would stop that. Another move that's better than my move is probably queen d6 check. I guess I just transpose this because I'm going to play queen takes knight anyway. Yeah. And white's up a piece, and I don't think he should have any problem winning. A fun way to win is b3, which defends the a1 square. And then if you play queen b3, then I would happily play check, and then queen here check, and trade queens, and I'd be up a knight. So that's one way to win. I'm sure there's others. So after rook takes d5 check, Nigel's opponent resigned. So that was a nice quick win with a lot of complications and tactics. And the better player saw more tactics than his opponent. And it really, like to me, because I'm biased for some reason, this opening should be more popular at the top level because it gives good chances to get an advantage. It's complicated. Super GMs never face it. So I don't know why people with white aren't trying it. It seems like it gives a really interesting game. Okay, this is Shabalov versus Jonathan Parker from Lloyds Bank 1994. Lloyds Bank was a very big open tournament in London every year, which I played in. See, what year did I play? I played in 1988. See, am I right? Yeah, I am right. I actually drew Smyslov there. And the sponsor of the tournament, I know this is going to be a shock to a lot of you, was Lloyds Bank. It's a bank in, I think it's an insurance company and a bank in London. And then they stopped sponsoring it, so now it no longer exists. But it did exist. Anyway, this is Shabalov Parker. Shabalov is an American grandmaster who likes to play unusual, tricky tactics, unusual openings. So the Vienna is right up his alley. So he plays the Vienna, and he plays the move bishop c4, and this leads us to the Frankenstein-Dracula variation. Now, there is a book on the Frankenstein-Dracula variation by Eric Schiller. And typically, if a book is by Eric Schiller, it's incredibly bad. Typically. Not always, but usually. That's the standard. And throughout the book, for reasons nobody understands, he'll stop doing chess analysis, and it's just word for word, like from the books Frankenstein and Dracula. He just writes, all of a sudden it's just like you're reading Dracula. It's very strange. Anyway, it's not a good book, but it's funny. So if you like funny, maybe you can still order it somehow, although I doubt it. Now, the Frankenstein-Dracula variation, and I used to play e5 with black, and I wouldn't play the Frankenstein-Dracula variation because it's too complicated. I played something simple, which I think equalizes. And I'll show you what that is. But it starts with black playing knight takes e4, which is well known in all kinds of king pawn openings as the fork trick. So knight takes e4, d5, gets the piece back. Okay, and in this position, the most common move is queen h5, which threatens checkmate. And if you play like a normal move to stop checkmate, then you can't play d5. So for example, if you play queen e7, which stops checkmate, then knight takes, and d5, I just take it, because your queen's not on d8 anymore. And queen f6 is even worse, because then knight takes, knight attacks your queen. So, okay, and you can't play g6, because queen takes e5 check is winning. All of black's pieces are attacked. So black plays, I guess it's the obvious move, I don't know, knight d6. That defends mate and attacks the bishop. And nobody thinks queen takes gives white an advantage because black plays queen e7. White has two pieces that are attacked. So white trades queens. White saves his bishop. Pretty boring. So grandmasters and others play bishop b3. Now in this position, which I've had with black when I played e5 a lot with black, I played the move bishop e7, which is very boring. And I have good results with it. Okay. But the Frankenstein-Dracula variation starts with the move knight c6, where black is defending his pawn, black's a pawn up. My move that I like to play gives the pawn back, but black can castle quickly. So my move is the safe move, and this move is the fun move. And we're going to have a lot of fun. So now white plays the move knight b5. It's a temporary piece sacrifice ending in checkmate. So black doesn't take the piece because you get mated. And if black does nothing, then white will play knight takes knight check, and then queen takes checkmate. And now this is funny. There was a game in Moscow played about 30 years ago, and Ivanchuk was watching the game. And Kaidanov said to Ivanchuk, "Why are you watching this so intently? Like what? Like a book opening. Why is this so interesting?" And Ivanchuk told Kaidanov that he thought king e7 was an interesting move. And the idea is I take with the king. Then you win your pawn back, and I play queen f6. White moves his queen somewhere, king back. And he thought that was fine. The engine doesn't agree with Ivanchuk, but it's very funny that that's what he was looking at. Like, he just made up the move king e7. It doesn't seem to lose immediately, which is funny. Okay, but the Frankenstein-Dracula variation is g6. The queen goes to f3, retaining the checkmate threat. Black plays f5. White threatens checkmate again with queen d5, threatening knight takes knight check and queen f7 mate. Now, black has to start sacrificing material because we don't want to get checkmated. And the only way to not get checkmated is to move your queen somewhere, and then I'm going to play knight c7 check and knight takes rook. But that's the main line. That's the Frankenstein-Dracula variation. Now you know why it's called that, because it's totally nuts. So queen e7, check, king d8, takes. And the Schiller book, I don't know if there's another book. The Schiller book's over 30 years old. On the Frankenstein-Dracula variation, basically starts in this position, because this is the beginning of it. I think black usually plays b6. Yeah. This is like all I know. I do know two things. The engine prefers white, but in tournament games, I think black does better. Because it's hard to play white, because white's queen actually has to escape d5, because it's going to get trapped and attacked and such. But I guess Shabalov knew this line, because he didn't have any trouble with his opponent. So he played d3, bishop b7, h4. White wants to play bishop g5, which would win black's queen. h6, which stops bishop g5. Knight takes b6. It's called a desperado. White's going to lose his knight anyway, so he gets a pawn for it instead of nothing. So in this position, white has a huge material advantage, but white's queen is going to get harassed a lot, and white's development with most of his pieces is bad. So the engine likes white, and I think in practice black does pretty well, except this game. Okay, so queen f3, the queen's going to go and hide. Queen h3, so then, if there's a discovered attack somehow, the queen is defending the g-pawn. So white's position looks silly. Queen h3, h4, all of white's pieces on the back rank. Black's pieces all developed. But white's up a lot of material. So white's up an exchange in a pawn. That's a lot. Okay, so black played e4, trying to get at white's king. Knight e2, takes, pawn takes. I mean, you could take with the queen, but the queen's actually defending g2. So when the black knight moves, there's not a threat against g2. Rook e8, threatening queen takes knight checkmate. Bishop d1, that's a really cool defensive move. f4, bishop f4, knight f5. Black sacrifices another pawn because black wants to open up the position for his pieces. White castles. Knight takes h4, getting one of his pawns back. And black has compensation, but maybe not enough. And just very complicated position where white's up material and black has an attack. And it looks like Shabalov was able to beat back the attack and just have a lot of extra material. Black keeps sacrificing all of his pawns. That's a funny move, queen a3 check. Black threatens mate with queen h2. White stops it. White's getting his queen to the back rank and defending this diagonal also. So the white queen did a lot of work. If you weren't paying attention, maybe my lecture's boring, so you were like doing something else. White played queen h5, queen f3, queen d5, queen f3, queen h3, queen a3, queen a8. And that's the exciting chess that we not only expect from the Vienna, but that we expect from Shabalov. It's a very exciting position with the material imbalance, and it looks like black's attack is over. White has a lot of extra material, and now black's king is going to get in trouble. White's threatening queen d8 checkmate. That's an unusual checkmate. Okay. And in this position, black resigned because black is down material and white's threatening checkmate. So that's not good. So that was a crazy Frankenstein Dracula. If you're interested to play with either color, then you need to look at a lot of games because it's super complicated. And you could see that black, I think after the opening, like that I knew, he didn't know like what else to do and just lost a lot of material. But Vienna is exciting if you want it to be. Okay, the next game is another British player, Matthew Turner, black against Safarli, who I believe is Azerbaijani. And if he's not, then he's something else. He's from Azerbaijan. This was also played in London in a rapid tournament in 2016. And again, for the lecture here, my goal is to show you the different variations. So in this one, we're going to look at another move. We looked at f4 the first two games. We looked at bishop c4 in the third game. In the fourth game, we're going to look at g3. According to Wikipedia, that's what people play now because f4 is too risky. And then I don't agree with that. I think f4 is still more common. But, g3 is definitely not risky. That's a very solid way of playing. Now, black has three ways to meet g3. One is to never play d5. So you play like bishop c4 and bishop c5 and bishop b4, and you're just not going to play d5. One is to try to prepare d5, c6, d5, and one is to just play d5. Those are like the three ways black can play. Okay, so Turner played d5, which I think is the most common. They traded bishop g2, and then I think they usually trade. I play bishop e6. After knight takes, now white plays pawn takes. I've seen this position before. Black played bishop e6, also okay. Knight f3 attacks the e-pawn, knight c6, and white castles. So black is going to have to, be able to defend his e-pawn, which is going to come under attack on the half-open file. Rook e1, and he plays bishop f6. That's not really where you want your bishop in a king pawn opening, blocked by these two pawns. Knight takes, and d4. Black hasn't castled yet, so black might lose a pawn. Black's e-pawn is under tremendous pressure. His king's on e8. And that's not really a good way to not lose a pawn, is to give up the 2 bishops and all the white squares. So black had to make a concession, and I don't really like what he did, but I'm not sure what he should do. For example, after e4, white has a lot of good moves here. One of them is c4. One is to play knight d2 and try to win this pawn for free. So he decided to take the knight's pressure off of e5 by getting rid of the knight, and then he castled. So d5. Now, if we take this, then black can trade queens and take on e5 either way. Probably with the bishops, you don't lose this pawn. And I mean, white's advantage here is symbolic. It's hard for white to win because there's not really a winning plan. You just say, like, I have better pawn structure. But bishop goes to d6 and black's fine. So he plays d5. That way he has more space and the 2 bishops. Keeps his bishop. And this just looks really good for white because the bishop on f6 is completely blocked on the diagonal, and white has 2 bishops. So black doesn't really have much to do because white has more space in the center. And black is just playing passively. Yeah, white's just crashing through. Okay, and this is a desperate move, e3. The idea is queen's attacking the rook, so you can't take with the queen because you lose this rook with check, and then this rook. That's when you know you're having a tough day, when you take a pawn and it hangs 2 rooks. So he's trying to make the game complicated. And white plays bishop g4 because the rook is defending the bishop. And now, unfortunately, queen's attacked, rook's attacked, the other rook's attacked. I have a passed d pawn, and I have the 2 bishops, and I'm up a pawn. So this opening didn't work out well for black. And white has lots and lots of extra material. Black sacrifices more material. White just ignores it. Okay, and I'm not sure why black's not resigning. Black's down a rook, so it's not good. Now he resigned, because now we're going to trade queens, and white's up a rook. So even the opposite color bishops can't save him. So, like, that game again begs the question, why don't more grandmasters play the Vienna? Because that game, he tore that guy to shreds. I mean, to shreds. Like, black just got crushed. And we're seeing white play different ways. We see white play f4 on move 3. We see bishop c4 on move 3. This game we saw g3 on move 3. And your opponent has to be ready for all of them. Now in the next game, the last one, black is the one who deviates. And this is a game where black is a very famous player, and white is actually a famous player on chess.com, but when it's not chess.com, then he's not so famous. So black is Abdusattorov, and I've lectured about Abdusattorov. He's one of the best players in the world under 21. He's over 2,700 FIDE. And he's playing Ponkratov, and Ponkratov is a very strong player on chess.com. In real life, Ponkratov's FIDE rating isn't as high as somebody like Abdusattorov. And this was played on chess.com in a rapid tournament. It was a knockout tournament, so it was an important game. And Abdusattorov played knight c6, which we haven't looked at yet. So that means Abdusattorov likes to play knight c6. Now, I'm not saying white got a big advantage out of the opening, but they got some wild and crazy position that nobody's ever seen before. And Abdusattorov, as I said earlier, he can't really fall back on his knowledge of similar positions, because these positions don't happen very often. So he's on his own. So you almost always play f4 against knight c6. d6 is pretty passive. So this is what white wants. White has a half-open f-file, so when white castles, his rook is really good. And they just develop their pieces. White ruins black's pawn structure. And you get this like really unusual position where black has 2 bishops, but black's pawn structure is not very good. White's taking control of the queen side. Really good domination of the c5 square. We got rid of black's 2 bishops. Now black has quite a bad pawn structure. He gets rid of his isolated pawn. And this is a very unusual move, taking with the c-pawn. If my student did that, I would yell at them. But Ponkratov's a lot better than me, so good job, Ponkratov. I think the reason he took with the c-pawn is he wants to have a passed a-pawn. And taking with the a-pawn leads to some trades on the a-file. Although, I would still take with the a-pawn. But white won the game, so I guess taking with the c-pawn is good. And you can see black has isolated, doubled c-pawns, and white has a passed pawn. And the bishop here isn't really, can't really go anywhere. Bishop just stays on e6. So he's like, well, my bishop can't go anywhere on the queen's side. Let's go to the king's side. And for reasons I don't understand, like I like white now. White's got that passed pawn. So I like white quite a bit. White's taking pawns. This is a very sneaky move, rook f1. After takes, it looks like white blundered. And if you want to know what a Zwischenzug is, or an in-between move, or an intermezzo, this would be on the cover of a book about that, this position. Because it looks like I took your knight, and your knight was defending your rook, so that's bad. But white plays the intermediate move, rook f5. So that's why tactically this works for white. Yeah, so white's up a pawn, and black has these terrible pawns. So he takes his pawn back, and this I don't understand. You know what? I understand it now. Yeah, like here black sacrificed the exchange. When I played the game over earlier, I didn't know why, but I didn't spend my life on it. But now that I've thought about it for 5 seconds, I think queen b3 is winning. So if I just move my rook somewhere, I think this wins. Because the knight's pinned, and I'm going to play rook f8 check, and you can't take with the knight. So, and you have to defend your knight. Your knight's attacked. I don't know how you defend your knight. If you play queen e8, rook f8 check wins, but you guys paid a lot of money for this lecture, so queen takes e6 is the correct winning move. If you could sacrifice your queen for mate, then you're supposed to do it. Okay, I didn't realize queen b3 is incredibly winning. So he has to sack the exchange, which he did. And white's up the exchange. And there's a funny joke in chess and bridge about this kind of situation. One of the most famous bridge players of all time is Barry Crane. And Barry Crane was bidding a contract, and a little old lady doubled him, double the number of points, like penalty, punish. And Barry Crane looked at her and jokingly said, "Do you know how many master points I have?" And she said, "No, but I know how many high card points I have." She knew what was in her hand, card-wise, didn't care how good he was at bridge. And, do you know how good Abdusattorov is? He's good, but white has more pieces. So you can be as good as you want, but when you're down material, then sometimes that don't matter. So white's up, it's a clean exchange, and white's dominating the f-file. White has a passed pawn, and black has doubled isolated pawns. So he can be Abdusattorov all he wants, but this ain't a lecture about his best games, and so everybody loses. That's the way chess is, except Jan Nepomniachtchi, but everybody else loses. And so, sometimes you lose. Truth hurts. And there's nothing black can do. He's just down material. So this is check, by the way, discovered check. Yeah, this black king's not doing so well. White's threatening b8 check. White's threatening queen takes knight, and there's no perpetual because if you check here and I go here, there's no queen d6 check, so the queen has to defend the knight. And black is just going to lose because he's down so much material. Now white's threatening mate again. And now your knight's attacked, and your knight can't move because you get mated, and you can't go here because I take it. And you can't play g6 because it's illegal. You can't play queen e2 because your queen's hanging. And if you play queen g5, then everybody in the lecture can win this position with white. So after queen e5, the only move I didn't suggest was queen d1. And then after queen f5 check, the truth hurts. Because rook e8 mate, you can pre-move it. You can play rook e8 before black moves, and it's going to be mate. So none of the moves I suggest to do anything, black resigned here. So again, we saw like 5 different variations in the Vienna. White won all of them because it's a Vienna lecture. The games were all really interesting, complicated positions, and usually the best player won, but obviously Ponkratov isn't as good as Abdusattorov, but he won with the Vienna anyway. And I think it's just fashion. It could be in 3 years, a lot of the top players are playing the Vienna. They're just not playing it now. It goes in cycles. And the last cycle was, in the 1880s. And nowadays, if you see a super GM play the Vienna, it's probably in a Blitz tournament, but people who have played the Vienna with white in Blitz are Carlsen, Nakamura several times, Mamedyarov several times, and very few GMs and super GMs will play it in slow chess, but again, it's just fashion. If somebody in the top 10 in the world plays a couple of Viennas, then we're going to see more Viennas. Because, people basically stopped playing the Italian game in like the 1930s. They just started playing the Ruy Lopez. And then they're all Ruy Lopez'd out, and now the Italian's coming back. The last 10 years, probably more Italians than Ruy Lopez's. So maybe we'll see a resurgence in the Vienna. But if you want to play the Vienna with white, you have to hope there's no resurgence, so your opponents don't know any theory, and then you just prepare, and then you get good positions with white. So easy peasy. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. Again, I want to thank Christian. He's a chess enthusiast from Vienna, Austria. Thanks for sponsoring the lecture, and I hope you enjoyed learning the Vienna game, and I'll see you guys next time with next week's lecture. Bye, everybody.